I'm Miranda Rake.
And I'm Sarah Wheeler, and this is The Mother of It All, where we take on motherhood through the lens of culture and culture through the lens of motherhood. Hi, listeners. Welcome back to our series exploring the impact of the pandemic lockdown on parents and families. In part one, Miranda and I discussed the results of our survey of almost 500 parents about their experience of parenting through a global pandemic and the ways in which those intense years continue to impact them and their families now, 5 years later. All month long, we're sharing conversations with a few of the respondents who had particularly striking or emblematic stories to tell. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Ariana, who moved to Norway just before the pandemic and had a very different experience from her friends back in the U.S. Thanks for listening. Thank you for being here, Ariana. It's so nice to be able to talk to you a little bit more about your experiences.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Now, you are in Norway. You said you've been there for a little over a decade, but you are an American. And I'd love to hear about how your experiences of the pandemic were influenced by the place you were, and maybe your sense of how that compared to some of the people you know in the United States.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about this because I feel like my experience was very different in a lot of ways. And I think what the whole experience of the pandemic highlighted to me more than anything else was really the true kind of power and might of the structural support that we have here, especially for parents of young kids, and what a safety net actually means when that kind of kicks in when you really need it the most. It's something that in the US we kind of talk about a lot, I think, with like politicians are using it as talking points and buzzwords and platitudes and stuff. But for me, it's like I've had kind of the lived experience of what those policies actually do to your life, especially when you're having kids and especially when you're in a crisis like this. And I think basically from day one of the first lockdown, a lot of that became really apparent.
And what were some of those kind of structural supports?
Yeah, so what was super interesting is I had my first daughter in actually March 2019, so it was a year before. So I was just coming off of my 10 months of paid maternity leave, as is the norm here. And so in January 2020, I went back to work. And like, to be honest, I mean, I'm so grateful for my 10 months of paid leave, but I was like really happy to be done and getting out and going back to the office. And that's when my husband started his approximately 5 months of paid paternity leave. But then I was only back at work for like less than 2 months. And then the first lockdown started in mid-March. So I came home to work from home there. And we had these like really optimistic ideas of how this was going to be. I like bought a desk to have in my bedroom and I was like, this is going to be my office. And he's like, yeah, you can be in there and I'll be in the living room with our baby. And we had a tiny apartment. And we're like, we'll have lunch together. And it's like, that's not how that works. It was super distracting for me having them there. And he was annoyed because this was supposed to be like his one-on-one bonding time with her. But we kind of made it work. And then like 2 weeks into that first lockdown, I got laid off. Wow. So I lost my job and then we're just like there hanging out. But then he went back to work in like mid-May. And he actually went back to the office because things opened up quite a lot here right away then. So then suddenly I was just back in this like limbo of, I don't have a job anymore and I'm back taking care of my daughter full time, which is not really how I had thought this was going to go. But right away, they were very efficient here in rolling out this like basically unemployment money for people who had been laid off as a result of the pandemic. So I started getting these payments right away, which wasn't my full salary, but it covered a lot of it. And then in addition, every single kid in Norway, from the time that they're born, their parents get a monthly check of like $150 just to pay for like diapers and stuff. So I was getting that. And then I also found out about this cash for care benefit that you can get here. which was basically for someone like me who our leaves had ended, but her daycare spot had not started yet. So I was getting like $750 a month in addition. So when you added up all those things, it was basically my original income.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was kind of like shitty having to be home with her again when I thought I wouldn't have to be. But it really takes the sting off of it when you're getting paid for your caregiving that you're doing.
Right.
So, and I mean, the other crazy thing was that, so we have universal daycare here, and that started in September of that summer. So I was basically just home with her for a few months, and then the daycare opened, and it was, even though it was COVID, it was like they were taking in new kids, and then she was just able to be there, and they actually never closed our daycare throughout the entire pandemic. So I would say that like right off the bat, and by the way, I did end up getting a new job almost around the same time she started daycare. So that was great. But there were just so many like what ifs if I was still living in the US, where like, would we've even gotten a daycare spot? Would we have been able to afford it? Like, could I have even taken this new job? Not knowing if she would be able to be in daycare or not, or like, maybe I would have taken it, but I would have had to start a new job with her at home. And suddenly I just started feeling like my life was very different from a lot of my friends back home and what I was seeing on social media and in the news and in the US. And it really felt like a lot of the experience of the pandemic was shared, but then with these kinds of things, I just felt like my life was kind of inconvenienced towards they were in full-on crisis.
Yeah. Did you feel hesitant to talk to people about, what your experience was like because of that comparison? Or I'm not putting this on you, Ariana, but guilty even?
Oh, for sure. It was a very strange experience. Like there was a period where, so I'm from Michigan, and there was a period where Michigan had the worst COVID rates, like hospitalizations and deaths of the whole country. And seeing how much my friends were like struggling with trying to work and having their babies in their laps, and like people's parents were in the ICU, and I'm just sort of like, oh, it's really boring. I can't go to a restaurant. Like, and I was obviously, we were dealing with it and struggling with it in our own way. We had like a pretty strict lockdown here, and our daycare was open. It stayed open, but it had shorter hours. So it was still like annoying and really cut into the workday. But like the level of crisis was just night and day, really. Yeah. And so, yeah, I did have a hard time talking to people about it, but that's kind of true of just my experience of parenthood here in general. Like when I try to commiserate with friends back home, they're like, oh, I'm so sleep deprived and I have to go to work in the morning, and they have a 2-month-old. And I'm like, oh my God, yeah, me too. I'm on my 8th month of paid maternity leave,
Yeah.
So it can be kind of hard to relate actually after a while.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. How do you think that affected your emotional experience of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird because when I had my first daughter, I still felt very American. I hadn't lived here for that long. And so when I got pregnant, I immediately started reading like every book you can ever read about pregnancy and childbirth. And yeah, my husband was like, like a lot of people just download this app where you like see how, like what fruit your baby is. Like you don't have to do an independent research project on this. And I'm like, oh, but I do.
Just do the
married
fruits.
a nerd. So yeah. But all of the books I was reading were in such an American context. So like a lot of it I didn't really relate to because, it's talking about going back to work right away. And of course that wasn't my reality. And like, even the way that we give birth here is quite different than in the US. And so then I also like wasn't really into the culture of Norwegian motherhood yet because I hadn't lived here long enough. So it was kind of like this isolating, like liminal state I was in. It was a little weird. But then when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden it felt like there was this commonality again, and not just like between Norway and the US, but the whole world. Like all of a sudden everyone was like juggling diapers and Zoom calls and freaking out because nobody knew what was going on, but we were all like watching Tiger King and like sharing memes that everybody could relate to. And then in a weird way, like during that time, I felt like I kind of shared something again with the mothers in my life back home. So I guess that you could say that was sort of like a momentary positive part of it. alongside, of course, all of these sort of disparities that I talked about.
Do we're having this conversation because it's been 5 years since the pandemic. And one of the questions we've been interested in is, how do you still feel the impacts of the pandemic? And I wonder if you notice any differences in the response to that between you and, your Norwegian friends versus the people that that had the experience that you described, like your friends back in Michigan.
Yeah, so I think like one of the main things that's different for us and for our daughter is that she was in daycare the whole entire time.
Yeah.
And so she is and was always kind of like a shy little kid. So, I mean, who knows what she would have been like if daycares had been closed the whole time. I'm a huge proponent of daycare. I love it. I think like I'm a better mom when she goes to daycare every day and I go to work every day, and they are wonderful. Her teachers that they have there, it's like a combined daycare and preschool that we have here. But and so I think that obviously, like in addition to surviving the pandemic and having everyone I love survive, I think the thing I'm most grateful for is that she could go to daycare every single day, because I think it had just done so much for her socialization, and they were doing like wonderful creative things every day, even though they were kind of in, smaller groups and doing things a little bit differently than they normally would have been. Like there's no way I could have given her that enriching experience at home. And I mean, I would have tried my best, but yeah, so I think that is something that's quite different. Whereas like a lot of my friends back home, their kids were, just home kind of for an indefinite period of time, or else every time, there was somebody had symptoms, they had to stay home for 10 days or something. And we didn't really have that. It was just basically like, as long as they were fever free, they could go back. And we also didn't do a lot of like testing on our kids. Our kids never had to wear masks here, like the older ones did, but never the little kids and toddlers. And so I think for me as a mom, I feel like my experience through that period of her being a little toddler was more like typical or normal than it, would have been for if I had lived in the US.
Yeah.
And what that would have done to my mental health at the time, I don't know. But I feel like I came out and she came out pretty unscathed, so to speak, like considering the circumstances.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about this, the structural impacts on this. I mean, we talked about it during the pandemic, but even now to feel that the kind of the ghosts of the pandemic that we still carry around are so heavily influenced by where we experienced it.
Totally. Yeah. Well, one thing I will say too is I am just so grateful I did not have her a year later than I did, because I had a lot of expat friends here who gave birth and were pregnant during 2020 and 2021, who were so isolated here. Obviously, travel was almost impossible, so they couldn't have their moms or sisters or whoever come over to be here with them when they gave birth. And in some cases, like had to give birth or go to prenatal appointments alone without even their husband. And when you're in a foreign country, and childbirth and pregnancy is already such a vulnerable time. And they are definitely still dealing with like the kind of trauma and regret and sadness of that. So I'm so grateful I didn't have to deal with that. But even like without being pregnant, then it was just like getting all these press releases and the signs and the notifications and all the systems and everything that we had to keep track of what was going on with the messaging around the pandemic, and having it be in a second language. Even that was very like kind of scary. It feels apocalyptic and you're not really sure you're like reading it right. And I think it's just it was a very good lesson in when you're going to move abroad and something like this happens like on a global scale, you might be stuck there and you might be really, really far away from your family and people you love for an undetermined amount of time. So that was sort of like a existential reckoning I had with my decision to move here and build a life here.
Well, it seems like you've committed to that decision since then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we're very much settled here. My husband also has a type of job where he can't really work in the US, and we own a home here now, and we spend a lot of time in the US on summer vacation, and otherwise I'm, especially as a parent of young kids, extremely happy and grateful to be doing this here. So
I wanted to ask you about one other thing, Ariana. A lot of people experienced a lot of strain on their marriages during the pandemic. We've coined this term as a culture of like the pandemic divorce. Obviously, it's okay that a lot of relationships ended, and the pandemic often was just kind of a forcing function, right? Instead of a cause of those differences. But you seem like you had a different experience. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I did, yeah. I think maybe it had something to do with the fact that my husband and I have already had kind of an atypical path to our marriage. We're from two different countries. We actually broke up for 2 years, and I moved to California, and he finished up school here, and then we got back together. And then after that, I made the decision to move here. We moved back to the US briefly at one point before we had kids. So we've been a very adaptive couple, I guess I would say. And he has been such a source of stability for me in my journey through my immigration. And when you move to a new country like this, you're basically redoing your adolescence in a way. You are learning a new language.
It's an interesting way to think about it.
Over. I was like a child. I had to learn everything and the way to navigate the system and the culture. And we've had to figure this all out together and be in a lot of situations that I don't think a lot of couples have been. So I don't know if maybe that sort of primed us for the sort of uncertainty that was going on through the pandemic. I think we just really supported each other through it. And there was a lot of difficulty with traveling back home. We actually traveled to the US 3 times during the kind of worst part of the pandemic. And it was such a nightmare of tests and, vaccine records. And he actually wasn't even supposed to be traveling to the US because he's not a US citizen, but he was allowed to be through me. So we had to have our marriage certificate at the agents at the airport. So it was so much paperwork. And he was just so insistent on me still maintaining a relationship with my family back home during this time. And so that really, showed me a lot too about his character. Not that I didn't doubt it, but, I think we actually came out stronger on the other side of it. And we were already sort of in the chaos of early parenthood anyway. And then it was okay, well, add in some quarantine and it was a rough period, but I think, it was, we made it. So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Of course. Yeah. No, I don't know. I guess I would just add that I truly believe in the power of policy, and I have been radicalized by that since becoming a mom and living here. And I do think that there is hope for these types of policies in the US. And I hope that, by talking about them more, and I think the more that we share these stories and different examples of ways that it's working in other parts of the world, hopefully we can eventually see some reflections of that back home. So.
Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ariana.
You're welcome. Thank you.
The Mother of It All is produced by Opus Knox Media with music from It's Electric. If you liked this episode, why not send it to a friend right now? Go on. We'll wait. You can follow us on Substack at themotherofitall.substack.com, where subscribing will get you episodes and bonus posts in your inbox and connect you with the Mother of It All listener community. Plus, become a paid subscriber and get a hot off the presses Mother of It All canvas tote. We're also on Instagram at The Mother of It All, and you can email us anytime with ideas or feedback at motherculturepod@gmail.com.